So hi everyone, all those that I can see, Gitanjali, Snigdha, Lakshita, I can see a lot of you here. Thank you for joining, and I hope that with my present condition, I can do justice to your presence and tell you things that will be of interest
Oh.
to all of you.
So a very, very good evening, all of you. I really have to kind of tell myself it's evening in India. It's morning here where I am. And I'm so happy to have Dr. Molly Kaushal in our midst today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is the Himalayan Institute of Cultural and Heritage Studies based in a little village called Jonga in Himachal Pradesh, district Kullu. And the whole purpose of having an institute is to have interdisciplinary talks and know about each other's work that is being carried on all over the Himalayas, from the north to the east. And we take great pride in saying that we've had almost 110 lectures over a period of a year, which are very, very important lectures. For those of you who are working in the Himalayas, I really highly recommend that you hear all the scholars that have been on the forum, and many of the talks are already on YouTube. Um, we do conduct courses, online workshops, and on-campus programs in the village, where we have a nice setup with Upadhyay cottages. In fact, one of my friends, Rajiv, is listening right now. My mother is right there in the Himalayas. So the world is, become so small that we can all be together, congregate together, and listen to good work, absorb, take time to listen, and apply it to our own knowledge pool. And with that, that's the introduction. I'm Sonali Gupta. I'm the director of the institute, and we have many here who are integral pillars of the institute. We have Dr. Anjali Kapila, Vijayalakshmi Bose, and of course Dr. Molly Kaushal, who's always been such a great supporter, and all of you audience who are regulars on our forum. And without delaying much, Dr. Kaushal is here with we started our nomadic series on June 27th. And this year, with her first talk, we went on, to her second talk, which took place on the 25th of July, and then the 29th of August. And now today, we are meeting again in November. So it's so nice to be listening to the progression of Dr. Kaushal, who's dedicated this talk to one of her dear people who Gadi, and I would love you to say a few words, ma'am, again about him, so that everybody comes to know who he was and what he meant to you in your research and everything. Um, Today, Dr. Kaushal is going to be taking us to Gadi contemplations on space and time. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Dr. Kaushal is an academic, curator, and a filmmaker who is now the mission director for the National Mission on Cultural Mapping, which is under the Mera Gaon Mera Dharohar, Meri Dharohar project. And they're mapping a mind-boggling 6.5 lakh villages of India, their traditions. So she formerly was professor of performance studies and head Janpat Sampad division of the Indira Gandhi National Center of Arts, and has been associated with the center since 1992. She's been engaged in research, documentation, preservation of cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. She teaches courses on Indian folklore at the center, has launched several research initiatives, conceptualizing and supervising several field studies, surveys, and research projects at IGNCA. And there is a lot more to her than what I have just read out. And over to you, Dr. Kaushal, with This Is How I See My World, Gadi Contemplations on Space and Time.
Thank you, thank you. Uh, Again, hello to everyone. New people have joined. Kaladhar Mutwaji is there from Kutch. Professor Krishnaya from Karnataka. Niranjan Kulkarni ji is there. So thank you all very much for joining. And as I kind of started thinking today at 5:30 in the evening, and I was wondering that with this condition of mine and not having really taken down any notes for the talk, what really could I be speaking on? Because I just shared that, right, just one chapter on space and time on the Gadis stretches beyond 100 type pages, and that is without the epic or the narrative, which is the backbone of the discussion, also will remain the backbone of the discussion today in my talk. And I had several questions. I looked back at my talks and I looked at what I was going to, really speak. And when one talks about contemplations on space and time are so multivalent. And one could take any one aspect of, I'm sorry, there's a mosquito around. So what aspect do I take? Obviously, I can't take all the multi-layered ways in which, space and time have been thought about in the Gaddi tradition. And even when I use words like Gaddi tradition, Gaddi cosmology, and situate it in today's discourse, I, there are a lot of questions that come to my mind. And sometimes I feel that, is it that I'm kind of, through my talks or through whatever I've said about the Gaddis, am I kind of, essentializing identity in a particular way? And is it framing them in a particular mold and say, so this is Gaddi, knowing also that Gaddi community is not a cohesive community, and that apart, societies move on, communities move on. If when I went there, and now when I look at the community, there is already a very well heeled Gaddi elite, very well educated, very well located in larger cities. And so what happens to the tradition? And especially when one is talking in terms of mythical structures, it becomes even more difficult, because apart from essentializing is also that it willy-nilly you kind of uh, maybe take stands which would be in today's terminology called Orientalists. So for me, there were choices and options that I had, that I could talk about, say, space and time more in terms of the physicality, more in terms of how the practices are located in space and time, how the concepts of space and time have gradually, in terms of the, as the materiality expands, how these notions that I'm here talking about as, essential concepts and understanding of space and time, how have they come to impact that materiality, and how has that materiality impacted these with these very concepts? And finally, is this mythical narrative, is this mythological repertoire and mythical structure or a cognitive system uh, any more relevant? Does it have a role to play? And wondered what I want to really talk about, and I decided to remain an Orientalist for this talk. And I had my reasons for choosing that, why I would rather be bracketed as an Orientalist in today's talk, and not just talk about the that passing of the time and changing of the materiality and the import. Because even when I look at the diaspora that has transferred itself from Gaderan or Gaderan to, or from Bharmor to Delhi and Jalandhar and Chandigarh and wherever, there becomes a very reinforced need for then reiterating a certain identity. And that need takes you, and how do you talk about that identity anyway? So when you look back again, they would be talking in terms of the land that they occupy. It's the homeland. The identity can only be constructed in within that locale in which that they left behind, or they still have relations with that. They have their bugris, they have their terrace fields, they still have an ancestral home, they may have a brother or a sister, some still have their parents alive. So they are still, and then they reconstitute it also in metropolitan cities, when they hold these dhams, when the festivals are taking place, they try to reenact the jatar, they try to perform the nuala, whether it is on the IGNCA stage or it is there in their own homes, or when they look forward to the jatras, or when they keep returning back home for any Noala ceremony that may be happening. So these mythical structures are not altogether forgotten, and they're not irrelevant, and they still remain very, very important to the way in a Gadi would want to talk about it. Second question that is really also related with it was that, is this mythological repertoire, or that what I'm going to talk about, that what I'm terming it as orientalist in some way, and in a serious way. I'm not kind of trying to sound nice about it, is that when a society is not cohesive, when there are caste groups, there is a power is at play in terms of what knowledge can be the domain of which caste, what kind of role that their different castes may play in the sharing of this knowledge domain, is then what became very important for me to think about was that how does this narrative, or how does this cultural text, and obviously when one is talking about space and time, one is talking about landscape, and when one talks about the landscape, we really you're talking about those cultural texts that have been generated by the physicality of the land, and it is changed into certain metaphors and symbols, and have been transferred back onto the physical landscape to tell much larger stories about oneself, about one's land, one's social relationships, one's relationship with the divine, and so on and so forth. And that's where I looked at the Sipis, I looked at the Halis, I looked at the Brahmins, and I looked at the Rajputs, which is who actually have the caste name as Gaddi, and the rest fall in it as a generic term. So, was this being shared across? And if it was shared, if this narrative was being shared, if this culture text was being shared, in which, how were they doing it? What were the strategies that the community was employing in order to make it a shared knowledge domain? And I must say that, despite all the discourse about that it's not a cohesive society, and you should not look at it in generic terms, and you should look at the power and dominance, and so on and so forth, that all caste groups have a role to play in this cultural text, and elements of this cultural text are shared. I mean, for example, we've all, in my previous talks, I talked about the sacred narrative of Savine, about Shiva's life. I've spoken about Mount Manimahesh Kailash. I've spoken about the Jatars. I've spoken about the pilgrimage. And the roles are assigned, even to the extent of who is the owner of which part of the narrative, who is the owner of which part of the ritual. So these roles are meticulously uh, distributed among different caste groups, and as that happens, it is not that the power relationships get obliterated in the process. They may, and they did in many of my instances. I did see that how the domain of the power asserted itself. But that apart, is that every caste group within the community carries this knowledge as an embodied knowledge, and this embodied enactment of the entire community coming together, maybe within the locales and spaces that are allocated to each within that domain, but as a common ritual, as a combined, integral, and cohesive ritual, then that it's presented as one. Everyone comes out of it feeling that it is a shared text. It is a text that's shared across caste groups, across all kind of social configurations, and so the ownership really in that sense belongs not just to the caste Gaddi, but to the community, with its differentiations that we can also call Gaddis. Now, having said that, and I need to then maybe, talk really about it. How is this text generated? What is this text, and what is it trying to say, and how does it act itself in the community? Now and then, where is, how is space kind of configured? How is time configured, and what are the means and strategies that are employed to configure and then relive the cultural text in the as a present, the past as a present? How is it reconfigured and relived? Now let's recall that the Gadi physical land, as it is given, is driven by its verticality. You have the high slopes, the dhars, the mountains, the pastures, high alpine pastures, and you also have the valleys. So you do have a horizontal plane and you have a vertical plane, but the dominant feature is the vertical movement along the space, and that makes the spatial and the temporal both being talked more in the vertical spheres as perceived, and as we will see as we go along. And horizontal is definitely taken along because the vertical is very much embedded in the horizontal. That is the valleys where the Gaddis live, and the high slopes where they herd their sheep and their goat. And again, a very important landmark which you're all already aware of, those who've been part of the earlier talks, is the Mount Mani Mahesh Kailash, which is one of the most prominent, most significant, and most relevant aspect of the Gadi physical landscape and its sacred landscape. And it is actually the presence of this mount in Burma that allows for interpretations of narratives, of thinking about the land in very sacred and divine terms. And so another this is one of the very important landmarks that we had discussed earlier. And for those who are new, I would just say that Mount Mani Mahesh Kailash is the abode of Shiva. It's a Kailash located in the Bharmar region. And this mount is held very, very sacred. It is believed that the narrative talks about that this mount was created by Shiva after he married Parvati. And here he lives in eternal bliss and eternal embrace of his consort, and keeps the Gaddis in his under his constant benevolent gaze until this union persists. It means it's auspicious for the Gaddis. It kind of symbolizes the well-being of the entire community and the land. The second very important landmark that we have in this terrain is the Chaurasi temple complex. We talked about this earlier also, but I will again, for people who joined us today, briefly describe this. And it's a very interesting. It's it's the center of everything social, cultural, religious, political, and historical uh, of the Gaddi history that we find located in Chaurasi. Even the administrative institutions, the panchayats, and everything, and the economic activity in terms of trade, shopping, hearts, is where Chaurasi becomes the center of all this. Chaurasi's historical importance lies in the fact that it's a complex which has several ancient temples that belong to from 7th to 10th century, built by the Chamba rulers, who were supposed to be actually the Gaddis who ruled Burma before shifting their capital in the 10th century to Chamba. And but more importantly for our talk today is it's not the historical importance so much, but how Chaurasi is looked upon. So I will stay with Chaurasi for a while and describe this, both for those who were present earlier and those who are new today, is that it is considered as a space which it is of course is a celestial kingdom, and it is not that it is like the celestial kingdom, but it is the actual original, if there is a physical celestial kingdom. So that is what Chaurasi is. And Chaurasi has, of course, in the center, it has a temple of Mani Mahesh Shiv. It has a Shiva temple. It has on its left side, on the right side, you have, and it is scattered with lot of lingams, and it is believed that initially there were 84 Shiva lings that were scattered all over this. And then again, there are further narratives as to what these lings signify. One of the narrative is that these are the lingas of all the Siddhas who accompanied Shiva when he first time approached Bharmor, and Bharmor at that time belonged to Bharmani, the original ruler deity of Bharmor, who later left this place and gave it to Shiva. And then the creation of the mundane world began. This is one narrative. Another narrative is, as I said, is the original celestial kingdom, is that it is, apart from being a very well laid out cosmogram, and also if we look at the original uh, layout of this place where even the royal palace stood in the northeast, it's a ideal model of a royal city in that sense. uh, but apart from that, this is a place where, whether you're a Hindu or you're a Christian or you're Muslim, whether you're Indian or wherever you may be born, once you die, Namaskar Vidya Singh ji, this very senior scholar folklorist has joined us from Lucknow. So anyway, so I think she's busy. So namaste, Vidya ji. Namaskar. Thank you for joining. Thank you. So the Chaurasi actually is a place where after we die, any one of us, anywhere born under any religion, any whatever, the soul ultimately has to come to Chaurasi. And there are stories of Krishan Giri, Baba Krishan Giri ji, who was a reformer and a saint, and a Dashnami sannyasi who came, made Chaurasi or Bharmor his homeland, and he did a lot of reforms for the community, brought in electricity, introduced horticulture, started hostels for girls, and so on and so forth. And he was deified in his lifetime only. He was a Naga Baba, and he also added to the mystery or the mystique of Chaurasi by actually saying that, day and night he can actually see these souls who are coming here. So Chaurasi is then also seen as the realm of the Yamraj, of the Dharamraj. It's the court of Dharamraj. So you have a drain that cuts across Chaurasi, and which is considered to be Vaitarni River. There is a Chitragupta little shrine with his book there. There is actually a huge a huge ling which is considered to be Dharamraj's ling, and there is these and so on and so forth. A lot of features to this temple complex, but basically a complex where souls come, and then according to whatever acts of commission and omission that they may have performed during their life, accordingly justice is done to them. And while this is being pronounced, they stand on this 2.5 pedi. It is called dhai pedi, 2.5 of staircase, where it stands. Despite whatever karma the soul may have performed, ultimately once it must return to land of Shiva. So despite being a celestial realm, a celestial kingdom, it is not a transcendental space. The transcendental space remains the topmost axis of this vertical space, and that is Mani Mahesh Kailash. So even a sinner would go ultimately first to Mani Mahesh Kailash, become one with Shiva, and only after that return to whatever lok that may have been assigned to him, whether it is the all kind of for hells, or it is heaven, or whatever. So now this whole Shiv Bhumi, where Shiva is situated in the form of the mount and is embedded deeply in the Yoni basin in the Jalehri, which is the valley of Bharmor. This whole route is a vertical route. It is conceived of in terms of a vertical pole. And very significantly, there's no singular center here. So whether it is the terrestrial world, whether it's the celestial world, whether it's the nether world, whether it is the Vaikunt of Shiva or Vaikunt of Vishnu or Vaikunt of Brahma, they're all located on this vertical pole. And this vertical pole also kind of configures a lot of temporal, the concepts of time, gives them to talk about time. This journey that is regularly happening both in terms of your mundane life, in terms of your cosmic configurations, and of course the pastoralism uh, that is taking place. So it is cyclical, and the movement keeps happening, and these poles also collapse many times. Here I'm reminded of a very interesting myth, I think, narrative. I don't want to call now anymore any narrative a myth, because this whole debate about myth and history is, led to all kind of ways in which the narratives are understood. So I will remain with a more neutral term, as a story, as a tale, as a narrative, as a, and so there is one Trilochan Mahadev. We had talked about it, and Trilochan was now, it was a Sippy. It's a low ranking caste among the Gaddis. And Sippis are traditional chelas, that are the mediums through which Shiva manifests himself. Also, they are the traditional, I won't call priests, but oracles, you want to call mediums, you want to call devotees, whatever word we may want to use, because every word has become so value loaded. So they lead the pilgrimage to annual pilgrimage to Mani Mahesh. So it's their domain. Yeah, they are the most ritually empowered community when this pilgrimage or the jatras are happening in Bharmor. So once Shiva, came, and this was a village of Sachui, which is located there. So Trilochan lived with his mother, an old mother alone there, and he was out of home for some chore that he may be performing. And in the meanwhile, the mother is visited by Shiva, who's disguised himself as a shepherd, and he has a sack full of salt, and he asked the mother if he can get any help in carrying this sack to Mani Mahesh, where he lives. So mother asks him to wait, and then Trilochan comes, and Trilochan offers to carry it for him, and so this whole journey takes place, and then Trilochan and Shiva, they reach the Dal Lake, which is located at the foot of Mount Mani Mahesh, which is the sacred lake, and where the annual sacred Nahan, the bathing takes place when the pilgrimage happens. And so here Shiva disappears, and Trilochan is desperate. He wants his money back. And he actually sees Shiva disappearing in this lake. So he jumps after him. And the point from where he jumps is called Kali Kund. It is like a endless dark pit, like a black hole. It will kind of suck in everything that falls into it. But interestingly, when he falls into Kali Kund, and he discovers that he is actually sitting atop Shiva's Kailash. So anywhere there, he tells Shiva that he recognizes, and then he lives there for 5-6 months. And Shiva asks him what is it that he knows. So Sippis are also considered to be traditional tailors. So he says, "मैं tailoring कर सकता हूँ." So Shiva says, okay, so you perform this activity for me. So he serves as a tailor for a few months, and then he's going back, and he's expecting that Shiva would give him something, and Shiva gives him a sack full of something and says, but don't you kind of, try to open it before you reach home, and don't see what it is. Now 6 months have passed, and 6 months is when the first Shraddh happens, when someone passes away, and now this boy is not returned, he's disappeared, so he's taken to be a dead. And very interestingly, the funeral ceremony takes place. But before it can be concluded, Trilochan returns, and then this whole funeral ceremony is transformed into a Nuala ceremony, and which is a Thanksgiving, and there's a lot of meanings to Nuala. So right now I'm not going into it, but later in the talk maybe we'll talk about it. And so this is the myth that serves as a charter to the entire for the entire pilgrimage journey, wherever he sat with Shiva, wherever he sat to share the smoke or whatever. All those places are marked, and then these are stopovers en route to Mani Mahesh Jatra. And but what this myth interestingly does is that it kind of if not completely do away with polarities, it definitely can easily transform into the other. So from Kalikund, you are up into the Mount Mahesh Kailash. So this whole vertical pole, which started from Saho in one of the narratives, and also in another narrative, we have from Karamuk to Karamuk, where the Shiv Bhumi starts, and Saho is because Shiva started his journey from Saho when he went to Mani Mahesh Kailash. So it kind of collapses that polarity altogether. Then there's a polarity of life and death that this myth also collapses, and that is of the life and the death. So while the ceremony, funeral rites are being performed, Trilochan is there, and the grief, the sorrow of death is then transformed immediately into celebration of life. Not only that, also this whole notion of the auspicious and the inauspicious are also kind of brought together and collapsed into one, when funeral is obviously is an inauspicious act. And Nawala is a very, very sacred ceremony, and how the funeral, and this trope is repeated in many narratives. Also, one narrative is that Shiva disappeared for 6 months, and then Parvati was arranging for his funeral. And before the funeral could be completed, Shiva returned, and so the ceremony changed into Navala. Now, Navala actually has such profound meanings for the Gadi, the way the Gadi would talk about their space and talk about the time, talk about the cosmos, talk about the divine, talk about house and sacrifice and all kind of, it's so much enmeshed into what the Gaddis do every day and what they do on ceremonial and ritual occasions, that it gives it a very deep speculative meanings that are then transformed into a diagram, a ritual diagram of the Nawala. We had talked about that diagram earlier also. I will stop on that for a while, a little later. So now this collapsing of it and the Nuala and Churasi and the Mani Mahesh Kailash are some of the very, very significant and relevant moments that are provided in the Gaddi culture text that makes them contemplate about, talk about themselves, talk about the body, talk about their relationship with the divine, and to uh, look at themselves as the very chosen children of the supreme reality. In this case, it is of course Shiva. Now, this Shiva mythology itself is very, very spatial. In fact, I mean, I can't go into very deep details, and I wish I could, but I would need 4 lectures that have gone by and 4 lectures that would come in order to kind of give you with all the examples, explain you with all the examples from this mythological repertoire and Savine to be able to discuss them in detail. So I would be mostly hinting at it, and maybe if you have questions, that uh, would be a time when I can take up few of these examples. Now, in coming back to Shiva, and I'll come back to Nuala after that, because it's important to talk about Savine once again on this platform, if to understand this whole process. Is that Shiva in Savine is actually, it's a very personalized account of Shiva's life. He's a personal deity. He's immediately available. He's a nomad. He's a shepherd. He's created the Gadi. He's present in every aspect of this physical landscape. He's traveling up and down this landscape like a nomad. He's made the Gadis also travel and given them a distinct identity, given them a distinct dress, given them two very important, distinct temporal punctures in their rhythm, that of the winter and the summer. So how the actual uh, practice, the actual movement then is turned into a metaphor for the divine and the cosmic movement around this whole universe, which is looked upon in terms of a vertical space, vertically expanding space, which then kinds of at the a top money, because there's not a top Money Mahesh is a mount which then kind of grows into is to escape into a space and a realm which is beyond space and time. It cannot be it is not the measurable space and time, but there are ways in which this immeasurable space and time can actually be configurated in terms of measurable time and space. One of the ways of doing it is, of course, the mythological narratives that are present. Second is the ceremony of the Nuala. And third is very important, is a diagram that is drawn during the Nuala ceremony. Shiva in his narratives here appears first as he's the creator god, um, and there's very interesting shift also in terms of, because he's also born of Anaj Guru, so the primacy is given to the seed. So Shiva could be born of the seed, Shiva could himself be the seed, or Shiva could shed the seed for the creation. So it's a seemingly very simple narratives of creation actually encapsulate very deep speculative processes of cognition in them. And so Shiva, anyway, in for him, in order for him to do creation, he needs the seed, he needs the water, he needs the female energies. And in the second, he is, and unlike where other narratives in which we see Shiva as possessed with the tamasic gun, here he is Rajasi, he is Kshatriya, he is the king, he is the ruler of Kashmir. And Kashmir is really the universe at that point of time. And there he plays, he goes out to hunt. And interestingly, the um, title of this canto is taken from Rigved, and it is called Haran Shikar. The archer, if those who are familiar with the Rigvedic myth of the archer, which is the Agni, which prepares the seed for Prajapati, and then the father wants to unite sexually with his daughter, and the archer then lets out an arrow, and which hunts him even till day. A lot of scholars have spoken about this myth. Now, very prominent about of them was Stella Kremerish, who's discussed this, and she looks at it as a phenomena of some cosmological phenomena happening in the, and gives explanations of, the rise of the Aldebaran and other stars and the sun. And then you have the other person, which with the scholars that come from the psychoanalytical school, so they read something else into the myth. But this myth has been kind of talked about, written about widely, and but Gadis take that title. But the myth, actually, the narrative that follows is really not about the archer, the Rigvedic archer, but is actually taking its content more from the narrative of Vanita and Kadru, where the fight between the Nagas and the Garudas. As I was saying, that how, portions of the knowledge domain have been shared, among different caste groups. This whole narrative has one. I made a mistake here. I'm sorry. So this Haran Shikar is not about Vanita and Kadru. Sorry, this is where Shiva go. It is more with the Tripura Nashak, the three cities, the Shiva's destroying of the three cities. This narrative is about that. But interestingly, these cities in the Gaddi narrative are actually temporal entities, and I talked about it in one of the talks earlier. And each of the demons that Shiva fights are actually the four different yugas, and end of killing all the four of them, the Sitalya Danu and the Lohiyar Dant and so on and so forth. There are four of them. They are four yugas. And I think in that talk I had talked about it, that why I look at them as concepts of time and not. And we talked about the Navala at that time. We talked about different artis, and we talked about the Char Yugon ki arti and how the four yugas are perceived in the Gaddi narrative and Gaddi thought. So I'm not repeating. It's that entire narrative here. And then Shiva from the king, and of course he saves. But then, in the process of saving his people, he also turns Mahakal, because he's destroyed everything. All the times have been destroyed, and he stands alone in the dark jungle, and the earth is littered with blood and dead bodies, and he is in that dark night in the dark forest. And Savine talks so beautifully about him and says that Shiv ऐसे अकेले रह गया है, like a drum, as a drum whose voice has left him, as a smoke fire from where the mendicant has moved away, and so on and so forth. And so he needs to reconstitute this universe all over again after he's become the Mahakal, after he's conquered Kala. And he cannot do that without Parvati, cannot do without the feminine principle, he cannot do without the seed, he cannot do without the water with which he began his universe right in the beginning of Anaj Guru. So obviously, the myth, the story, the narrative takes him to Parvati, and the Shiv Vivah is another episode where he is the creator of the universe. But he cannot create the universe alone, and here the Nath and the Siddhas. Actually, a lot of spatial and temporal uh, 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 configurations that have happened in the thought process of the Gaddis is draws also heavily from the Natha and the Siddha Sampradayas, where the Shiva and Shakti are seen as in complete union, in eternal union, and the phenomenal world can only occur when the differentiated Shiva, where Shakti then differentiates itself from Shiva, and the phenomenal world comes into, becomes manifest. So that whole notion of, how the virajas, how the configuration of the phenomenal world takes place, and how in the end again Parvati and Shri Shiva unite. So building on that whole Nath and Siddha philosophy, the Shiva Shakti union, the Gaddis then move on with this narrative. And I'm not going into the Shiva. We had a separate talk on that. And then after that comes the Garudim. And as I was saying about Garudim, that the interesting, this is what the Garudim is, actually has this whole episode of the Nagas and the Garudas battle, which is very well known, comes from the Mahabharata also, Vanita and Kadru. Interestingly, in the Nuvala, the Garudim is sung, but this battle, this Naglila also it is called, is the domain of the Hali. So we talked about the cities, and now I'm coming to the Hali community, and they are the healer chanters. And this part of Garudi is actually the most potent of chants for healing, for which they have been given a very specific instrument, and only Halis can play it. And Halis is the lowest of the in the caste hierarchy. It's the lowest of all. And this um, this whole instrument, we talked about that also, is actually Parvati's body. And it is only the vibrations that are coming out of Parvati's body that stir Shiva, that the creation can happen, that the knowledge can be revealed. And this portion of Garudan and this body, this Parvati's body, which manifests itself in Dhutaru, is given to the Hali. So everybody in every all the ranks that you have in the Gadi society have a little role to play in the configuration of this entire narrative scene as the history, as हमारा इतिहास, गद्दी का इतिहास, ये उनका पुराण है. तो now coming back again to the so this whole narrative is sung at the Nuala ceremony. And what could be this Nuala? Why is this Nuala happening? And it is, I mean, I could talk about Nuala endlessly, because it has so many layers to be discussed. So many meanings are built into this single ceremony. Uh, to begin with, a square diagram is drawn, others for the ritual performance to take place. And I talked about it, that it has 32 squares. And let me kind of point out here that the most archaic of Vastu Purusha mandalas are also made of 32 squares. And though the 32 square mandala is not the actual ground plan of the temple, but it is at the base of every construction, whether it is in terms of conceptual configuration or physical configuration. And then this further has diagrams and the squares. There you have a 81 square, 69 square mandalas, and from which then the architecture, the temple rises. Precisely in the Nuala ceremony, which is happening, and where this square is built, that you invoke all, not just the entire cosmos, but the entire mythological repertoire is reconstituted, reconfigured in this 32 mandalas. And then each square, it doesn't have graphic representations, but different deities are invoked, different practices in life are invoked, the social, the cosmic, the historical, all these are invoked through this mandala. And in the center of this mandala is the Prithvi Kund. It is a little pit. And from that pit, then the Mount Kailash rises up from this pit. And atop this are the nine strings of garland, which are seen as the nine streams of celestial Ganga. So you are also reconfiguring and reconstituting the very time of the creation that takes place. And Shiva is the one who has to rise from this Prithvi Kund. So that is the Jaleri that we had talked about earlier, and the Mount Kailash that rises from here. Now, going deeper into the studies, and I was very fortunate to get a very vast canvas for comparison in the book written by Stella Kramrisch. I mean, a huge monograph presence of Shiva. So I started looking at this whole ritual and its implications and the metaphors and symbols being used in the Gadi Savin, and began to compare it in terms of what was happening at the level of the Upanishads. How was Shiva being conceived? What were the rituals that were being conducted? So it gave me a very vast canvas to compare. And finally, why I call this, I said that I'm happy and I'm willing to call this talk as an Orientalist interpretation or whatever interpretation, is that I found that actually I could shut all that knowledge that was there in these in this monograph, which encapsulates the Upanishadic speculative thought and and how in many ways that Shiva is conceived both in terms of spatial configurations and temporal. And I can just look at the Nawala ceremony. I could look at the meanings that were being built at the time. So another text that is being created while Nawala is being performed. And I could compare the two speculative thoughts. So despite what othering that we want to do, despite uh, looking at that speculative thought in terms of only worldviews. After all, we've always talked about the other as having a worldview, and we are having a profound philosophical basis. Then also the numbers play a very, very important role again, and these are the numbers that remind you of all the numbers associated with Shiva. So whether it was Charasi Mahadev, whether it is these 32 Kothe of the Vastu Purush Mandala, whether it is number 3. And all these numbers then were actually spatially configurating the time. So the temporal and the spatial came to be expressed in terms of numbers, and in which the Charasi Mahadev, which is the Shiva's ultimate undifferentiated form. Very interestingly, in one of the narratives that was sung by Kirparam, one of the bards, he was a Hali bard from village Lahar, that he's talking about that Shiva tells Parvati after a wedding that मैं 5 शब्द का पुतला हूं. I am constituted of 5 words. मेरे 5 अंश हैं. And one ansh I have given to the earth, the second I have given to the Indapuri, third I have given to Niranjan Puri, fourth I have given to Pyarpur, and the fifth I have taken myself. I've poured it back into myself. And if with that fifth essence or that fifth पांच शब्द या पांचवा शब्द और वो पांचवा अंश, I am situated in this, on this planet, in this universe, in the form of Mani Mahesh. So Mani Mahesh is my physical form, physical manifest form. Whereas I, with my fifth word and all the 5 words that I have distributed, I reside inside it in an undifferentiated form. And it is only after the two meet and they perform the dance. And so easily said, I mean, इसमें कोई रास की बात नहीं है, महारास की बात नहीं है. Simply, लाल सेठ, आपको नहीं पता है शिव पार्वती के डांस के बारे में? ऐसे नहीं, आप बताइए क्या नाच करते. तो हाँ, घी कटोरे का नाच वो वाइफ और हस्बैंड के बीच में होता है, घी कटोरे का. So the mother, the womb, and the fertilizing father, and they being coming together, and then going back into some of the very important narratives that take us back towards the Siddha and the Nath tenets. Another set of narratives that take you back towards the Upanishad. You can kind of, begin to comprehend that how deeply thought out and how meticulously configured, both in terms of the ritual and the narratives that are sung and performed, that these two notions are being worked at among the Gaddi community. And I think I should stop here. I've almost taken 1 hour, and I'm ready for questions.
Not at all, ma'am. Even 1 hour seems less in terms of, what all we learn from you about this wonderful community, and so much to them, and the painstaking work that you have engaged with, and with all these different lectures that we have come closer to what we knew about the Gaddi. So that's really amazing. And I would like to open up the forum for questions. So whoever's ready, please do ask your questions. And I do find, our regular on your talks, Kamalvati Ramsubek from Trinidad. Yeah.
Your friend, you went to the same school, I believe.
I think, yeah, St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain. Yeah. So, yeah, do we have questions?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
I don't have any question, but I compliment to Dr. Molly ji. Dr. Molly, my heartiest congratulations to you for this wonderful, the presentation, and we are really enlightened because although I belong to Himachal Pradesh, but I was not aware about this Gaddi community much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamlesh ji. Thank you.
Molly ji.
Okay.
Yeah, Krishnaya ji.
So very inspiring talk you have given on Gaddis, because my curiosity is because in Himalaya the actile chamar is very much used for the greater tradition, but the same tradition in the little tradition in our part also used. It is a transformation from greater tradition to little tradition. I do not understand that is from, I'm in the extreme south. So that is Himalayan part, the tribal culture they use in, because I don't know whether how they use in what context. Just curiosity regarding the yak tail.
Yak tail.
Yes, chamar.
I don't know if they use yak tail. Maybe I do know that they have churi, which is a ritual with mix of
No,
yak.
because the people who bring that yak tail here, they say that from Himalaya they are bringing.
In Himalayas, there are so many communities, and I don't think particularly yak tail is of. No, in the ritual, if you mean, they don't use any yak tail. No.
Okay,
They use more feathers.
Ma'am, I have a question, and then I'll take Dev's question. So, the Nuala, you said it happens with the Gaddi community, right? The Nuala. So I have a very dear friend whose mother is from the royal family of Chamba. And in their, so from Chamba, they have these people who come and they do the Nuala, but they themselves are not Gaddis, but they have a tradition from an association with Chamba. So his mother was married into the royal family of Kutleher. So does that kind of peter off into the, like with the erstwhile royal families, with the Nuala and the influence of Gaddis, it percolates even in other families as well?
It does, and Nuala is being performed in Chamba all over. Nuala is being performed in Kangra and Bajnath, wherever the Gaddis have found their settlement. So obviously, and Shiva worship is something which is prevalent in this entire. So Nuala at one level is nothing, but it's a Thanksgiving ritual to Shiva, where you sing bhajans and artis and anchalis to Shiva, to Sri Ram, to Krishna, and to all other deities. And then you also sacrifice. And there's also very interesting again narrative about the sacrificing of the goat, and it again takes you back to the initial sacrificial rituals in the Rig Vedas, and you find so many parallels and similarities. So in fact, Krishnayaji was talking about little and great tradition. I think whether I look at Krishna or whether I look at Shiva, it's the pastorals who have given us the knowledge system, and it is we build that knowledge system really up from there. So for me, I'm in this little and great tradition. Really is a very complicated issue, and I don't think that it is so easy to define that. But yeah, the kings, as you already know, the Chambyal kings had a very close relationship with the Gaddis, and also politically they wanted to reclaim this whole hinterland. So building up an identity of them as Gaddis was very important. And even say 2 decades ago, the Chambyal kings would regularly visit the Chaurasi temple complex during the Jatar, and the pilgrimage will only take place once the king has kind of offered his prayers at Suraj Lingam, is that little shrine which contains linga called Surya Ling, is the considered to be the ancestral shrine of the Chamba king. And this whole Jatar was called also Sarkari Jatar. Now, of course, the government is taken, but even while the Chamba rulers were holding this Jatar, all the money and everything would come from there. And then there is this whole history that we talked about, Charpatnath, and we talked about the Lakshmi Narayan temple earlier and the relationship between them. And the Chadi actually of Charpatnath first comes from Lakshmi Narayan temple. So also here bringing together the Vaishnava worship and the Shaivite worship at one point, and bringing Chamba and the hinterland together, and then mapping this entire territory as the territory of the Chambyal kings at one level and of Lord Shiva at another level, is something which is played up again and again in both the Chamba Vanshavalis as well as the narratives, oral narratives that are existing among the Gatis. Yeah.
We are so looking forward to the publication of your book.
I hope it really happens. Yeah. Yes.
Molaji, I have a question to you.
Yeah.
Say, in southern part of India also, most of the persons belong to Shaivites. But according to Himalayan tradition, you told about hunting. Is there any community, especially the devotee of Shaivites, and a hunting community is there?
See, I don't know about the entire Himalayan belt, but if the belt that I am acquainted with is, no, there is no relationship between the hunting communities and Shaivite worship. And also, as I said, that this narrative of Shiva on deer hunt, Haran Shikar, is not about hunting so much as it is about actually of killing the demons, and the demons actually are personified manifestations of different times, of different kalas, of different yugas. So here it's a story of Shiva becoming the Mahakal. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So let's take Dev's question, and then I'll take Subhadeep's question. Dev, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a great talking, listening to you speak. It was your voice is amazing. So I have a very simple question. Like, are the Gadis purely nomadic, or do they have a base somewhere?
See,
and my other
yeah, it's a very good question. Gadis are these are the terms that the scholars have coined for them. They are nomadic, they are semi-nomadic. Some would say no, but they are pastoralists. Some would like to say no, they are transhumant, and so on and so forth. Gadis have always had homes. Okay, so even while they were like fully a transhuman communities and going up the mountain tops with their flock, they always had settled homes at Barmor. So a sedentary life was not there, but if we want to say a settled, so in that movement, in that vertical moment, the time was punctuated where Gadi would be in his home, would be settled there for a short while, and then it will move.
It's a cycle.
It's a cycle. So more you can say as a transhuman cycle, but which has it. So even in Kangra, Gaddis had settled homes, and even in Barmor, they had settled homes. Yeah.
And out of all the stories that you've heard from all of the areas that you are, what is the most fascinating one that you heard?
I can't hear you well. Can you repeat yourself, please?
Out of all of the stories and the myths that you researched in your time, which is the most fascinating one that you came across?
Most fascinating. That's a very tough question. Because I don't see that any of this myth or narrative, they exist in isolation, nor can their import be understood in isolation. If I were just to take the Trilochan myth, I will really never know that what is its import, why is it so important, What does it mean for the verticality? If I didn't know Saveen, I would not know why Trilochan had to become Charasi Mahadev. So for me, this whole repertoire itself was very fascinating, and I see is as a singular text, but with a multivalence.
It's a multi-universe of many things to create a one universe.
Many things. Do you get kind of? I think I've lost.
Yeah, we are viewing Professor Krishna's screen for some reason.
Professor Krishna, can you please stop screen sharing? Or maybe you can stop it at your end.
Yeah, I think I can. I can stop their video. Did it go? I don't know how. Okay, stop sharing. Yeah, we are back.
Okay.
It must have been some error.
So yeah, so they've. I mean, these. Yeah. So I see it as a singular text with multiple things that you built through this particular text, and all kind of narratives, all kind of concepts, all kind of rituals, all kinds of performances. They all come together to build this one cultural text.
Yeah. And another thing, I was watching a documentary because I teach this course on the Himalayas. We were talking about transhumans and all of that, and chanced upon some videos on wonderful videos on YouTube. But I'm sure like the footage that you've taken back in the day must be so valuable. And I hope you make it into a film or somehow do something with it.
There is a film which I made long back ago. You can, I think, access it on YouTube. It is called Landscaping the Divine.
Landscaping the Divine.
Space
Okay.
and Time Among the Gadi. Yeah.
I will definitely post the link on social media handles for sure. But when I was watching that video, one thing that really struck me that they love for their herds. A question is always asked that, are you going to stop doing this? And they said, I don't know about the future, but right now I get everything from these animals. Like it's a lot of hard work that they feel that you have to be of another metal to handle something like this. But because the gratefulness that they have for these creatures and the way they have influenced their lives and their meaning and everything they think about their own community stems from that. It was so heartwarming to hear those words, that there are still people that way who value their ancestors' paths and the things that they engage in, and they shudder to think about the future, but they try not to do that. So I will share those videos on YouTube and yours as well, because it kind of reminds you that that not all is lost. Not all is lost.
And also, I think it's a trope. It's more like what you have as literary trope. So when you're asking questions, so what you get back is a narrative, and these narratives have certain tropes that are repeated. So even when I went in '96, it was said, oh, we've given up shepherding, अब कोई नहीं है, वो सिर्फ पाल होते हैं जिनको हम हायर करते हैं, वही जाते हैं. But also is true that apart from agriculture and apart from herding, even then in 1996 already I'd said that Krishnagiri ji, who actually entered Barmore in 1950s, he's introduced horticulture. So then there were years when horticulture was seen as something which will replace, and I have personal narratives of shepherds who sold their flock of 200 goats, 250, and then they won't be able to sleep at night. They will hear all these voices and whatever. Then a period came in, I think 1 year, this whole apple harvest was destroyed, and people thought that maybe they need to go back. So yes, all this mobility is happening, but Gaddis haven't gone anywhere, the flocks haven't gone anywhere, nor is that horticulture cultivation, apple cultivation is stopped. And now, as I said, that there are these people who are out in metropolitan cities making their earning from absolutely diverse jobs. And but as I said, that along with the mobility comes this great need to assert one's identity. And the narratives have a beautiful way of reasserting themselves and jumping back into the discourse about the people to whom they belong.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. So we'll take Shubhadeep's question and then I'll take Dr. Bhattacharya's question. Shubhadeep, over to you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, ma'am, for this fantastic presentation and helping us live the mythical landscape of India so well. Right from every corner, actually, every part and nook and corner of India is full of these landscapes, mythical landscapes. So that's something which was very, very exciting. And Gaddi, what I've been doing a bit of trekking in the Himalayas, so I've interacted with them and have enjoyed their conversations. Very simple and yet quite deep in observations, and of course these connections that you have referred to. The only question that I have, and I went to Burmore very recently, only a couple of months back, I was in Burmore, and looking at the Chaurasi temples, I found this great temple of Narsimha. I just wanted to clarify with you. I mean, are they also Vaishnavites, or I mean, it's quite a huge temple. I mean, the only temple which is as big as the main Shiva temple is actually that one, and it was quite imposing, quite interesting, quite prominent, and just wanted to have this particular thing clarified.
Actually,
Thank you.
yeah, very interesting. Actually, even before Narsimha as avatar of Vishnu enters Chaurasi, you have a lot of oral narratives about the Narsing. और पूरे Himalayan belt में is this Narsing is a spirit, this is one of the Jamaats, and has its own narratives and stories. So Gaddi, in their own peculiar, interesting ways, have linked Narsing worship and the Narsimha there. Now coming to the Vaishnav, and see, Gaddi thought has actually never been a very static, and you can't say something like indigenous thought process or specific to Gaddi process. I mean, like Krishna Giriji, I've already said that the Buddhist influence was there. Both the Siddhas of the Buddhist rank and Siddhas of the Shaiva rank were there. When Chambyal King and Charpati Nath, who was actually the Shiva devotee, is the one that then constructs Lakshmi Narayan temple in Chamba, and the Chambyal kings then take to Vaishnav worship, and it has had its influences back in the hinterland as well. And the whole Mani Mahesh temple, where this link is Shivling is located, and I think it must have happened after Krishna Giriji that it is considered to be Harihar. So where the divine is present both in its Vaishnav and in its Shaivite avatars. At the same time, the two very important dates that I mentioned that punctuate the Gaddi time is one is Janamashtami, and Janamashtami is when all the Jatar starts, but Janamashtami is also considered to be a date when Shiva actually kind of leaves Mount Mani Mahesh Kailash, because he's a nomad, he's a shepherd. So for 6 months he goes to Pyarpur, to the Netherlands, and for 6 months he goes back to Burmore, to Mani Mahesh. So do the Gaddis do. So Janamashtami is thought of a date when the flock and the Gaddi begins to yearn. They start looking towards Jan. They're not yearn at this, but they start, and they kind of think that it's time now to move towards the lower valleys of Kangra to the forest. And then Shiva comes back on Janamashtami, and that again comes back on Shivratri, again has very deep temporal and spatial significance to that. I'm not getting into it, but it is the month of Magh, and then what Magh does. And how Shiva's whole journey and the sun's journey, the solar calendar, and all that, come together in this narrative. But yes, so Janamashtami, the Jatra start, and the first Jatra that is offered to Narsim, and Narsimha is then at that time worshipped as Krishna. The baby Krishna has taken birth. And so, yeah, definitely. And also this Navala ceremony, interestingly, because the Savine ends that, after everything is kind of resolved and, Shiva retreats, he takes away his manifest form and he retreats into his absolute space, giving the reins to Krishna. The Krishna birth has taken place, and now Shiva goes back from this mundane world. At the same time, the Navala, before it ends, it sings this whole Anjali, in which Krishna has taken birth, and Shiva and Parvati, they mount their bull and then they go to see Krishna. And then after they've had the darshan of Krishna, then they decide to retreat. And also on Janamashtami, Shiva gives the reins of the world to Vishnu, who had been residing till then in Netherworld.
So they complement each other. I mean,
Yeah, the myth,
yeah.
Vaishnav and the Shaivite are
Okay.
equally
Okay,
present.
wonderful. That's amazing to realize, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. It's amazing,
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for that insight. And over to Dr. Panda for her question. Dr. Bhattacharya Panda.
Thank you, Sonali. Molly, I'm a bit intrigued. Actually, I always wanted to ask you this question. Did you face any language problem, particularly while you have to decipher some of the traditional, rituals or something while they are narrating? So this is my one question, very basic question. I should have known it earlier. And second, I'm sure when you will be publishing the book, I'm sure there will be they have the folklores on the ecology and environment.
Yes, yes, yes.
Like Aesop fable story, the moral teachings not to destroy the nature. And if the people destroys the nature, then the nature revenges and the wrath of the nature destroys the people. Because I have seen it among other communities in other parts of the Himalayas. So these are two questions I have.
Okay, the first question is whether I faced a language problem. Maybe in terms of certain words that I may have not understood and I kept asking them. But since I come from Himachal and, it wasn't strange to my ears and it was not something that I could not understand. And I insisted, throughout that people speak in Gadyali to me. So I think over a period of time, I just got used to the language. I never
Right.
learned the language formally, but wherever I would have problems, I will of course ask. And since Gaddis know Pahari well, they know Hindi very well, so they explained. And then over repeated visits, I think language ceased to be an issue. Yeah. Though if you ask me, can I speak in Gadyali? Of course I can't. Yeah, but if somebody speaks, I will know what it is, and I'll do my, immediately equivalent accent to my Hindi as if I'm speaking Gati. Yeah, it's funny how we, unconscious strategies we deploy to identify with the other.
No, actually it happens. You understand the language, but you can't speak.
Then, of course, is the thing about you asked about environmental degradation. That long back I had, of course, written about it. One So obviously, if it is your resource base, you're going to, you're going to take care of it because you need it. Your flock needs it, and all your economy is dependent on that ecological resource. So they got these also again through narratives, and again through certain observances, see to it that their ecological base is not destroyed. And
Yes.
out of which are also that you have various deities whose permission you have to take before you
Mm.
go. Then, there are regulated time where you can actually relieve yourself. How many times in a day can you relieve yourself? How
Mm.
many, you cannot light the fire again and again, so you'll only cook once. And then you will not throw the food. You'll have to dig the ground and then bury the leftovers there, so you don't kind of pollute this environment. And there are so many other observances. You don't laugh very loud because the mountains are fragile, the stones will
Oh, that's
get you.
interesting.
So there are social, there is a proper social and ritual behavior uh, that strategizes your relationship with the resource base that you're communicating with, interacting with.
Yeah. Right.
Thanks, Nandini. Yeah.
Over to Sumit Dey for his question, and then I'll take Dr. Chakravarti Mahajan for his.
Yeah.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah. Hi.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. And we have been like enriched, and we have been learning so much from you for the over the last 1 decade, maybe the time I know you. But now to ask the question, you briefly spoke about the Nath yogis and the Gaddis. So my question is, in the Gaddi worldview, we have known how Shiva is perceived, and you touched upon the idea of Nath yogis, and I think this is a different trajectory altogether, I know, but if you could just focus a little more on that and enlighten me and us.
Okay. Now, this whole Churasi is actually known as Siddh Kshetra. And Bharmor has seen many outsiders that have been coming here and making Bharmor their homeland, which, as I said, also included the Kiras coming from Tibet. Then you have the Gurkhas coming from Nepal. And you have all the mendicants and all sadhus of all hues and all ranks that it is believed that the Siddhas and the Nathpanthis actually entered Bharmor sometimes in 10th century. There is this, in the Vanshavali, there is this whole story about Charpati Nath, which is one of the very well-known 84, one of the 84 Siddhas, and that the king Sahil Varman didn't have children, and the Churasi Siddhas entered Bharmor, and then they blessed him with the child, and then gradually then moved, and then he had 10 sons, and he started venerate. There are other people who view that the Siddhas and the Nathpanthis actually entered Bharmor sometimes in the 7th century, in Meru Varman's time itself. Then the very myth of Shiva, when he enters Bharmor, which is at that time a forbidden sacred grove of Barmani, her kingdom, that he comes with the 84 Siddhas, and those lingas that are 84 lingas that are supposed to be there in the Churasi complex actually belong to all these all the 84 Siddhas who performed austerities here, and then they one by one they all passed away. So these narratives, oral narratives about their presence and historical evidences of their presence in Bharmor is very much there. Nathpanti's healing, especially the Gorakhnath, has a great influence in the healing. You have the Panchbiri concept also there. You play out Gugar, which is a Gugga Jatar, who's who's part of this whole Gorakhnath narrative that we have Guga Zahar Pir's story. And then that is what is available to you in terms of the narratives. And then you go to Saveen then, and you begin to see this, which I discussed in some detail when I was talking about Shiv Vivah that is happening.
Right.
And the Shiv Vivah story is very different in Gadi Shiv Puran, and there is no Parvati here who is yearning for pining for Shiva, but it's the opposite is the true, and it is Shiva
Right.
who
Right.
wants to marry her. And then you have see what is happening is that what I'm doing is comparative study at one level, but also a kind of interpretative anthropology. I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm looking at the symbols, I'm looking at the metaphors, I'm looking at the text, and I'm trying to find linkages and then interpret it in a certain way, and so when I look at this whole narrative of Shiva and Parvati, like my informant when he was singing and he was telling this story, and here Parvati tells Shiva that I will only marry you if you have the entire cosmos sewn onto your body, onto your gown, the wedding
Right.
gown. And then it sings of how Shiva then begins to dress up for his wedding, and he reveals himself as the cosmic man, the Virata Purusha. And so with the the Kirkati Rani, the Pleduses on his gown, the insects, the sun, the moon, and then his whole wedding barat with everything that you can think of the phenomenal world. And this is on the insistence of Parvati, unless he would have not fallen in love with this woman, then this whole episode would not happen. So then you wonder that what is this relationship? Why is Parvati asking him to dress up in a particular way? And then you go back to the initial first canto and you say, what's happening there? Now, there also the concept of the Shakti is at the center, though there is an Anaj Guru and there are these three sons, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. But then he's asking his sons that if you want to be the Lord of the universe, and the Rachana, the creation has still not happened, it's all happening in some intangible virtual sphere. So he says, you will have to wed your mother. You will have to annihilate me and you'll have to wed your mother. So only Shiva says, okay, it's all right, I'll do that. Then I began to look at this myth and I went to Garhwal and I saw similar myths where they're more detailed and where you have this whole myth of Parvati. It's a kind of inverted, where you have Parvati wants to wed one of he had three sons, which is Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, and only Shiva agrees, and then that myth goes into another level. So I looked at that myth. Then I looked at when the creation has to take place, Anaj Guru says that you have to go to Chaturbhuj Shakti in the waters, where only if she gives you the Istarbami, that can the creation happen. That is the mitti from her womb, the soil from. So the only person who actually manages to get this Istarbami is Shiva. And very interestingly, the myth says that what is the reason why she denied Vishnu and why she denied Shiva, why she denied Brahma? Because Vishnu went and said, Jagan Mata, Istarbami mitti do. And she says, tu kaun hai jo Istarbami mitti maangne aaya? So he says, main Vishnu. He says, kitne karodon Vishnu hue, tu kaun sa Vishnu hai? And the Vishnu has no answer, he comes back. So remember this, second Brahma goes, same thing happens. Now Shiva goes and she says, kitne karodon Shiv hue, tu kaun sa? So he says, main maa Gauri Shankar hu. So he puts Gauri. And that is when she agrees to give the water. Now
Right.
water as a feminine principle at one level. Then going to this whole myth of the wedding. Then is in the third is even more stronger relationships are established between the concept of the sound, the body of Parvati, the body of Shiv. And this is the context is that entire hidden knowledge, the knowledge that is there about this universe, the knowledge of how it all came to be, the knowledge which creates and the knowledge which destroys. All this happens through sound, and sound is actually part, or a sound is Parvati. So it's Parvati who's initiating this whole process. And then Nanku, as he said, कि आप इतने सवाल पूछते हो, जो कुछ शिवा में के अंदर छुपा हुआ था वो पार्वती की वजह से ही बाहर निकलता है. So their language is not the same as that of, Parasamvit and Viraj and Chidavilasa and Satchit Anand. But when they say that it is in eternal union of Shiva and Parvati, in which, he exists on the Mani Mahesh Kailash. When they talk about the Shabda Brahman in terms of, Shiv jo hai wo 5 shabd ka putla hai. When they're talking about the Vratyas, there is so many layers to it. How then this Vratya moves across, and then he comes and creates Chaurasi, and then he creates Parvati Ling, and then he creates, upward facing Linga. So there are a lot of these from where you kind of journey through this whole repertoire of narratives and rituals to then actually read the way that I have read the narrative. Someone else would like to read it maybe in a different way, but that's how I read it.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Molly, Anjali ma'am.
Anjali.
Molly, you know what?
Ah.
Listening to you, I just have to say, I don't know how to reiterate a million times. This book has to be written. Landscaping the divine, divinizing the landscape. I mean, it is so important. Just listening to you, hearing you talk. I don't know.
I think I should take all the recordings and,
Molly, please do that. Can you do that? I think I'm speaking on behalf of this whole gathering. It is absolutely such outstanding work. And, I also wanted to say that when you talk about the vertical plane and the spatiality and temporality as represented by the vertical plane, so the vertical plane is not only exterior in the geographical terrain, it's also inside, within the human person. Isn't it so beautiful that you go inwards into the different layers of your being? So the outside is only representative, and the locational aspects of Mani Mahesh being in that vertical plane is also representative of the verticality of our inner layers of being.
Absolutely. And then there are narratives. The narratives do talk about, the Gadi narratives do talk about this inner dimension of the verticality.
Yeah. I'm so happy that you brought it out. It really resonated with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, Professor Venkatesh has also joined. I say namaste to you, Professor Venkatesh. Thank you for joining. Yeah. So,
as ma'am just said, I would totally appreciate as well if you could just record all these myths and everything so we could listen to them.
Yeah, I will.
So we will take Dr. Chakravarti's question next.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, good to see you after a long time. I begin to miss you. Yeah, you should come to agency. Yeah.
But thank you very much, Sonali and Molly ma'am. Sonali sent me a message few days back, and then so much is happening online that you really don't get time to. Even on a Saturday, Sunday, and Fridays, we are like online always. No, so that's one reason that. But amazing, and I think what just has been said. In fact, I don't have a question per se, but then it was so, it was so beautiful. The whole description and the way you were describing time and space. And I was also, and when you were saying you're not a trained anthropologist also, I was thinking that, okay, you're not a trained anthropologist, but you're so much better than many of us who are working on Western Himalayas, and I'm glad that you're not an anthropologist, because you bring this combination of Indology and folklore and anthropology is quite rare. So in that sense, I think over the years, we have also learned a bit from you. First, when you were talking about time and space, I was actually thinking like an anthropologist, and I was wanting to hear more about calendrical time and ritual time, and I wanted you to go to how a day is spent in the life of a Gaddi, and then how a week is spent in the life of a Gaddi, and a month and a year, and then how time is structured, and then of course verticality and horizon. But the way you have done it is actually beautiful. Not following the standard practices of how time is seen and how space is constituted, but then I think that's about how you see what how you have perceived what Gaddis, when you listen to their folklore, when you listen to their ballads, and this is how this reality comes to you, and I think that's perfectly fine. This is how a reality, and when we think that realities can vary, realities can be multiple, and I think the way you perceive Gaddi reality is equally beautiful, the way anybody else would view Gaddi reality. But then I think the moot question now is, we really want to hear more on the book, and which chapter is this, and how many chapters, and when are you kind of
So this is
finishing the book?
No, this is my 5th chapter, which has come to 100 pages. It's all there. You can see both sides typed. The point is not that I don't have a book. It's just that I don't know why I have not got around editing it. And, I will tell you, I think also one of the reasons, as you said, I have all these calendars, the ritual calendar, the agrarian calendar, the seasonal calendar, the pastoral, all those maps of all those dhars. And then I come to this, and I wasn't able to integrate maybe at that point of time. And secondly, I didn't know how to bring together so much of data together. But I think over now that, I've stayed with the second way scheme of looking at things rather than the conventional calendrical systems and spatial temporal, movements, maybe I should really get this published. Yeah. Maybe you'll help me edit this.
Yeah, sure. I think we need to have more such sessions, and this is going to happen very soon. So thank you so much. We are really looking forward to reading your book.
Thank
So,
you so much.
yeah.
That's really, yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And this all, even though you say you're not an anthropologist, but, your insights and the way you have dealt with the subject over the years, I think it speaks of not only anthropology, but so many other disciplines that are embedded in the way you do research. And, Shikha was Shikha Rai. She's an archaeologist. So, we are a bunch of archaeologists together too. She was asking me, we need to do this archaeologically. And we do have a project with Flinders University on transhumans, and we are looking at it archaeologically. But because of COVID, everything came to a standstill, and hopefully 2022 will usher a new period in kind of research work, rigorous research work, which kind of embraces all these other facets and archaeology as well, because it's evidence. Evidence is also like the evidence of the past is also so important in understanding the progression of these narratives over a period of time. And we have discussed this with you before too, Dr. Kaushal, with Dr. Kapila and Vijay Lakshmi ji about our project on wisdom traditions that we really want to float in the future. So yeah, all of you who are in attendance here, it's so nice that we all can hear Dr. Kaushal speak about these things and understand them in better perspective. And with that, Dr. Kaushal, I would urge you to kind of leave us with, there's so many words of wisdom that you have kind of helped us listen to and pay attention to. But today, what is the word of wisdom for us as we leave the audience, you leave the audience today? What would you like to leave us
I
with?
really don't know. That's the most difficult. I think word of wisdom for me, at least, if is that, what I learned being part of IGNCA and what I learned when Kapila ji was there and I was a young girl who joined IGNCA, it is that she kind of, trained our eye to look for connections where apparently none existed. So when we begin to look at interconnections there, then, a whole new world opens up in front of us. And of course, how we would interpret will depend on many other things. It depends on the disciplinary backgrounds we come from, the boundaries we draw, the ideologies that we follow, whatever. But to be able to see the interrelatedness of all realms of practice, including aesthetics, is something I think every scholar should go equipped with in the field, even whether they would use it later or not, but they should be able to see that these interrelationships exist and things don't really exist just in isolation. I can't just look at the epic and say, I'll only study the epic. I'll only study its aesthetic contours. I'll only study its structure. And I will not look at the community. I'll only look at in a particular context in which it is being performed. But then I can see that, this narrative is omnipresent like Shiva in all aspects of life. So unless I can see that, but that's really for myself, someone who really does this interpretational kind of work, but others, so it's very difficult to really give words of wisdom. Everyone has their own wisdom and their own disciplines and interests. So.
But we really need to have like a conference back at the institute one day, with all of this. We all congregate together, and whoever has been doing work on nomads, semi-nomads, whatever maybe we call them, but about these traditions, I think that'll be really fruitful for so many people as well, just to come together and talk about
there
it.
is one very senior folklorist who's joined from Lucknow. I can see her. Vidya Bindu ji, आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगे? विद्या बिंदु जी,
मेरा ऑफ हो गया है, आवाज मेरी
आपकी आवाज सुनाई दे रही है।
बहुत सुंदर व्याख्यान दिया मौली, और मेरी बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं हैं
जी।
वीडियो मेरा ऑफ हो गया है।
हाँ, वीडियो आपका ऑफ हो गया, पर आपकी आवाज बहुत क्लियरली सुनाई दे रही है।
अच्छा, बहुत सारी बार आपका व्याख्यान था, बधाई, शुभकामनाएं, धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू, आप आई इसके लिए बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आपका। हाँ, थैंक यू सो मच। So before we end, I would like to also think of Ramlal ji, because this whole lecture, 4 lecture series was in his memory. He was my Rakhi brother. He was a Gadi. And so Corona took him away from us. I've known him since 1996 when I first stepped in Burma. And so I tried to keep his memory alive and through this series and pay my tribute to his memory.
And what a lovely tribute, spreading the knowledge that kind of defines the Gaddis. So I think this is befitting, of you kind of to do this for him. I must be so happy wherever he is. In Mani Mahesh, perhaps, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
and Professor Venkatesh has something to say.
Yes, Professor Venkatesh.
First of all, it is always exciting to listen to you. Once again, it's a good opportunity for me. And now, with the exploration of this Himalayan ideology about Shiva, I think it's a time to think of a pan-Indian comparative approach to this Shiva traditions.
Yes.
Because at local levels, particularly, for example, as my study on Mailar Linga,
Yeah.
so there are actually ethnic traditional groups which are worshipping on this particular deity Shiva at local level and also at pan-Indian level, because pan-Indian Shiva is different from the local Shivas.
Absolutely.
So therefore, I think you can take a lead in this direction
I
also.
always requested you, you remember, I said we should do a workshop or a seminar or a
Yes.
conference where we can have different Shiva myths being narrated. That would be wonderful because that will give us again a huge corpus of comparative data.
Yes. Recently, when I met you in IGNCA, we had a discussion to think of marriages of
Yeah.
deity from Kashi and from South India. So like that we thought of actually.
So let
But
us do it. Now it is even easier with the virtual mode. It will be again building up a rich archive. Yeah. Of,
Yes. Yes,
Shiva.
ma'am. It is great to listen to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm really thankful that you've joined Professor Krishnaya and Professor Bhagwat Salla Reddy. Thank you so much for becoming part of this. And hopefully you'll stay permanent.
Also for organizing this.
And even though we are departing, I think there's still some lingering questions. And Vibhaji just wanted, she's down with cold, but she really wants this question to be asked about seasonal variations of living patterns among the Gaddis who move upland and how it is reflected in mythology.
See, because that'll take me altogether in a different terrain altogether. But very interestingly, not just in the mythology and not just while they shift homes and shift base, that this is reflected right in Burma in the building of constructing their houses itself. This seasonal variation is very much performed and practiced. So you have these Gaddi houses, which has an obra, which is also the womb where also the rituals take place because it is directly connected with the bhumi, but it's a kettle shed. Then they have I think forgetting the term, the middle, the first floor, and then you have the topmost floor. So when summer comes and winter, even while people who are residing in that house and they're not traveling, they make this travel within the house. So when summer comes, they all move up to the top floor, and when winter comes, they move on to the second floor. Okay, so even in patterning the very house that this movement is reflected. Now things have changed. People in Kangra, like, they have permanent houses, they have permanent lands. They may have even lost touch with Burma, and they have pakka houses, they're educated, they've got their other jobs. But when we were traditionally looking at this seasonal variation, then when the Gaddis move from Bharmor to the higher passes, they have no concept of house. So their lifestyle is completely dominated by the environment that they're facing. They don't even have caves, like, they don't enter into sheltered rock spaces. They are sleeping in the open along with their flock. It is, and that's very interesting because up in the mountains, the need for even a shelter is not felt. But then Bharmor and the house is a very important element in their life. When they perform this pilgrimage to Mani Mahesh, I think I mentioned in one of these that they make this, 4-5 पत्थर लेके कोठी बनाते हैं, एक छोटा सा घर बनाते हैं. So the inner desire is to have this home, and they say कि when we make this कोठी, तो जब हम दूसरे लोक में जब शिव के पास जाएंगे तो ये हमारी कोठियां बनी होंगी, जहाँ पे कोठी means a room, a small house, not a bungalow or anything. So we'll have a place to. So this thing of a constant movement is one, and this whole desire, inner desire to be. And I think it is also because, unlike other nomadic communities, this journey is punctuated by this little period where they are at home. They are with their bagdi, with their land, with their children, with their wife. They have a house. They celebrate these jatas. So this whole concept of the village as a bound entity, which is their place, is very much is present in their lifestyle. And when they were coming to Kangras, the men would be in forest and the women would be performing the role of domestic ritual, domestic helps in Kangra homes, and the relationship traditionally were pretty good. And even the Kangra people would wait for the Gaddis to come because of the manuring and all those things. But increasingly, even in Kangra, they began to have these permanent homes. So I can't think of a Gaddi who's only perpetually on a move, but the movement is so important, which is reflected even in a sedentary household. And at the same time, this desire to possess a house while you're in movement, are both present simultaneously in the practice, in the social practice, whatever, daily life practice of seasonal journey.
And I think this element was talked about by Stephen Alter 2 weeks ago. He was on the forum. He was talking about this whole idea of movement in the Himalayas, and I feel that the Gaddis best encapsulate that whole, what the mountains were to people in terms of movement, in terms of the gods and the goddesses having the summer and the winter abodes and all of that, and how seasonally that whole life turns. And of course things have changed so much, but the narratives still live on, and we still cling on to those things. So that's really nice. And thank you so much, ma'am, for that wonderful insight into today's session and enlightening us all yet again.
Thank you so much for providing me the platform to talk so much. I don't think any other platform would let me do that. So I'm really thankful to you, and thankful for putting me back in touch with what I must finish before I go to Mani Mahesh. So yeah.
I don't think that will be for very long, but for a very long time to come. But thank you so much, Dr. Kaushik.
But with COVID, no one knows anymore.
No, we know.
We know. Yeah.
You won't go until you have to finish your work.
Okay. Shiva
मकसद पूरी करनी है मंजिल पहुंचने तक, ये नहीं होगा ना.
वो शिवा नहीं आने देंगे ना, अंदर नहीं आने देंगे.
हाँ.
True.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shanali.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all of you for, continually spending.
Thank you, Kamalji. I hope you, just 1 minute. Kamalji, do you want to say anything? You seem to want to say something. Kamal? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. No, Molly, I'm always amazed at how much you have in your head. I'm amazed at your voice. You do not get tired. I learn a lot. I learn a lot. I learn a lot. And we do, when I got married to my husband, the only deity he used to worship is Lord Shiva. So we have a Murti from India, marble Murti. He's gone. My husband is gone now, but the Murti is there. That was our first Murti. So we always did Shiva Puja. And from the diaspora, people came from the north, and we, as you have seen in our temples, we worship all our deities, but Shiva is always one of the main deities. And we feel strong. There was a conference in Jamaica, and they want me to do Om. They taught about Lord Shiva, and these were not Hindu people. So virtually I did the Om because they too taught about Lord Shiva. Very, very important to all of us. And Molly, I must praise you again and all your supporters, but amazing. Keep it up with God's grace and Lord Shiva's grace. And we always love you. You know that.
Thank you so much.
Sonali, nice hearing you again with that beautiful voice. All the best to all of you. To all of you.
Thank you.
Yes,
And those
thank
of
you all
you
very much.
And those of you who are joining us for the first time, you can keep updated with the events. You can join our non-chatter WhatsApp group. So, we don't disturb you much except with, our own posts of the Institute and relevant posts. And if you get too bored, you can always leave. It's up to you. We don't get upset if you leave because like the seasons, everything, is cyclical. So all of that, you can follow us on social media and all, Facebook and Insta and LinkedIn and all of that. So do support this the Institute and what it does. Just attend our talks. That means a lot, having a good audience who hears all of this, because that's the way we kind of keep this narrative alive, tangible or intangible. This is our way of contributing to what we all feel passionate about, especially in the Himalayas. So on that note, Dr. Molly, last words for the session today. And of course, miles to go before you think about Mani Mahesh.
Yeah, I want to just acknowledge Sukrita. Sukrita was here, I can see, and she liked the talk. So I don't think she's there anymore, but I acknowledge her presence and thank her. No, I have no last words, Sonali. Really, last word belongs to him because he put the fifth word inside himself. So what can I say? Yeah.
Okay. So have a lovely evening, and we should be back next week again, same time, 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Until then, watch out who's going to be our next speaker, and lovely having you all here as always.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Sitaram.
Chakravarti, come to IGNCA soon.
Okay.
I will, ma'am. I will.
When
Yes.
are you going? When are you leaving?
April, ma'am. April. I'm going for 3 months. I'm not going forever.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Chakravarti Mahajan, you received the Charles Wallace, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yes. That's really, really very, very good. So all of you, we'll see you soon. And lovely session, ma'am. Thank you so much yet again.
Thank you. And Vibha, you
Thank you,
take
ma'am.
care.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe. Get well soon.
Yes,
Yeah.
you too. My goodness, I'm like,
you all very
I have
much.
a pile of tissues here.
I know. Very bad.
Bye.
Bye.
Please.
And I'll
yes.
post the session.
Good to see
on
you. And you've got a big project. I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, sorry. We are chit-chatting, Sonali.
No worries, no
I
worries.
got hold of Molly. So
Yeah.
what is this large project?